My name is Rebecca Riversong, and in 1974, at the age of 32, I became one of the most arrested Native American women in Washington state history. 12 times that year, I was handcuffed and dragged away from the Nisqually River by state game wardens who claimed I was fishing illegally on my own ancestral waters. But what they called criminal activity, I called exercising the treaty rights that my great-great-grandfather had signed with the U.S. government in 1855. What started as a simple desire to feed my family with salmon from the river, where my people had fished for thousands of years, became a battle that would reshape Native American law, inspire a movement for indigenous rights, and teach me that sometimes the most powerful act of resistance is simply refusing to disappear when the world wants you to vanish. I was born on the Nisqually Reservation in 1942, the daughter of Henry Riversong, a veteran fisherman who had learned the traditional ways from his grandfather, and Martha Riversong, a woman who worked as a seamstress to supplement our family's income during the lean months when fishing was poor. Our small wooden house sat just 50 yards from the Nisqually River, and I grew up with the sound of flowing water as the soundtrack to my childhood. My earliest memories involve sitting beside my father on the riverbank, watching him read the water like other people read books, understanding where the salmon would run and when the fishing would be best. "Becca, this river is more than water," my father would tell me as we prepared our nets in the early morning mist. "This is the lifeline of our people. For generations beyond counting, the Nisqually have depended on these salmon runs to survive the winter, to feed our families, to trade with other tribes. The salmon come home to spawn in these waters, just like our people always come home to this place. We are connected to each other, the salmon, the river, and the Nisqually people, in ways that go deeper than any law or treaty white people might write." Those childhood lessons about our relationship to the salmon and the river seem like ancient history when I graduated from high school in 1960 and moved to Seattle to attend the University of Washington. For 8 years, I lived in the city, earned my degree in education, worked as a teacher, and married Robert Thundercloud, a Maka man who shared my love for our traditional cultures, but had also embraced the opportunities available in urban areas. We built what seemed like a successful middle-class life, complete with a comfortable apartment, steady jobs, and plans for starting a family. But something was missing from that urban existence, a connection to the land and water that had shaped my identity but seemed increasingly distant from my daily life. The turning point came in 1970, when my father suffered a heart attack and I returned to the reservation to help care for him and maintain the family fishing operation that had sustained us for generations. "Becca, I'm getting too old to fight the state wardens every time they try to stop us from fishing," he told me during one of our conversations about the increasing harassment Native fishermen faced from state authorities. "But these treaty rights we have, they're not just pieces of paper. They're promises made to our people in exchange for giving up millions of acres of land. If we don't fight for them, they'll disappear." The legal context that made our fishing rights so controversial stemmed from the Medicine Creek Treaty of 1855, in which the Nisqually and other Puget Sound tribes had ceded vast territories to the United States in exchange for small reservations, and the explicit guarantee that we would retain the right to fish at all usual and accustomed grounds and stations. For over a century, our people had continued to fish according to traditional practices and seasonal patterns that predated white settlement by thousands of years. But by the 1970s, Washington state officials were claiming that tribal fishing rights were subject to state regulation and that Native fishermen had to follow the same rules and seasons that applied to non-Indian sport and commercial fishermen. This interpretation would have effectively eliminated our treaty rights, forcing us to compete for limited fishing licenses and restricting our access to the waters that treaties had guaranteed would remain available for our use. They want to turn our sacred relationship with the salmon into just another commercial fishing license, explained Billy Frank Jr., a Nisqually fishing rights activist who had been arrested dozens of times for defending our treaty rights. They want us to forget that we are the salmon people, that our survival and the salmon's survival are connected in ways their laws don't understand. The decision to return to traditional fishing despite state harassment was both practical and political, as I needed to support my aging father, while also asserting rights that belonged to me as a member of the Nisqually tribe. The first time I set my net in the Nisqually River in March 1974, I felt a deep sense of coming home to something I had forgotten during my years in the city. The rhythm of watching the water, reading the currents, and working with the seasonal patterns of salmon runs connected me to generations of ancestors who had sustained themselves and their families from these same waters. "This is what your great-great-grandmother did to feed her children," my father said, as he taught me to mend nets and prepare for the spring salmon runs. "This is what your grandmother did during the Depression, when there was no other work available. This is what I've done all my life, and this is what your children should have the right to do if they choose. These aren't just fishing rights. They're the foundation of who we are as Nisqually people." The first arrest came on a cold April morning when State Game Warden Tom Peterson approached our fishing site and demanded to see licenses that we didn't need according to our treaty rights. "Ma'am, you're fishing without a valid state license during closed season," he announced, his hand resting on his service weapon. "I'm going to have to ask you to pack up your equipment and come with me." When I explained that I was exercising treaty rights guaranteed by federal law, he shook his head dismissively. "Federal treaties don't override state fish and game regulations. You can explain your theories to the judge." The handcuffs were cold against my wrists as I was led away from the river where my ancestors had fished since time immemorial, charged with violating fishing regulations that we believed had no legal authority over tribal members exercising treaty rights. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was being arrested for practicing traditions that predated Washington statehood by thousands of years, on waters that my people had never ceded to any government, for catching fish that were essential to our cultural and physical survival. Before you continue this powerful journey of resistance, tradition, and justice with us, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more incredible stories about the individuals who fought against overwhelming odds to protect their heritage and secured rights that benefit us all today. The night I spent in the Thurston County Jail was both humiliating and radicalizing, as I realized that the comfortable middle-class life I had built in Seattle meant nothing when I tried to exercise the most basic rights guaranteed to my people by solemn treaties. The other inmates were mostly white men arrested for drunk driving or bar fights, and they seemed amused by the presence of an Indian woman who had been arrested for fishing. "What's next? Arresting Indians for breathing," joked one man. His comment was meant to be supportive, but it highlighted how absurd the situation had become. The legal strategy developed by our attorneys focused on the Federal Supremacy Clause of the Constitution, which established that treaties between the United States and Indian tribes took precedence over state laws that conflicted with tribal rights. "Rebecca, your case is part of a larger battle for tribal sovereignty that's being fought in courts across the country," explained our lawyer, Janet McLeod, herself a Tulalip tribal member who had been fighting for fishing rights for decades. "Every time you get arrested, every time you stand up for your treaty rights, you're forcing the legal system to confront the question of whether promises made to Indian people actually mean anything." The support that began building within the Native community was inspiring and energizing, as tribal members from across the Pacific Northwest rallied to defend fishing rights that were fundamental to many indigenous cultures in the region. The fish-ins that followed my arrest brought together hundreds of Native people and their allies, creating a movement that would become known as the Fish Wars and would ultimately reshape the relationship between tribal nations and state governments throughout the United States. The second arrest came just 3 weeks after the first, when I returned to the Nisqually River with even more determination to exercise my treaty rights despite the legal consequences. This time, I was accompanied by my cousin David Riversong and 2 other tribal fishermen who had decided that collective action might be more effective than individual protests. "If they're going to arrest us for being Indian, then let's make sure they arrest enough of us that people pay attention," David said as we prepared our nets in the pre-dawn darkness. The confrontation with state authorities was more intense the second time, as game wardens arrived with backup officers and seemed prepared for resistance rather than the peaceful fishing they had encountered during my first arrest. "You people need to understand that treaty or no treaty, you're not above the law," declared Warden Chief William Patterson as he supervised our arrests. "These fishing regulations exist to protect the salmon runs from overharvesting, and if everyone decided they could ignore conservation laws, there wouldn't be any fish left for future generations. Thatri, his argument about conservation was particularly galling, because it ignored the fact that native people had been successfully managing salmon runs for thousands of years before white settlement, and that the dramatic decline in salmon populations was primarily due to dam construction, logging, and industrial pollution, rather than tribal fishing practices. Chief Patterson, my people were conserving these salmon runs when your ancestors were still in Europe, I responded, as he put me in handcuffs for the second time. We've never taken more than we needed, and we've never forgotten that we're responsible for protecting these fish for our grandchildren. The media attention that began focusing on our fishing rights struggle was both helpful and problematic, as newspaper coverage and television reports brought public awareness to our cause, while often misrepresenting the legal and cultural issues involved. Many white residents of Washington state had been taught to view Indian treaty rights as unfair special privileges, rather than as payment for the millions of acres of land that tribes had ceded to make room for white settlement. These Indians want special rights that other citizens don't have, complained one letter to the editor in the Tacoma News Tribune. If they want to fish, they should buy licenses like everyone else. Treaties signed over 100 years ago shouldn't give them the right to ignore modern conservation laws. Such attitudes reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of both the legal status of treaties and the historical context in which they had been negotiated. The third and fourth arrests followed in quick succession during May 1974, as I established a pattern of returning to traditional fishing sites despite repeated legal consequences. Each arrest was becoming easier emotionally, but more costly financially, as legal fees and lost income from time spent in jail or court began to strain our family's resources. Becca, I support what you're doing, but we can't afford to keep fighting this battle indefinitely, my husband Robert told me, after posting bail for the fourth time. Maybe we should consider moving back to Seattle, where we can build a stable life without constantly fighting the government. But moving back to the city felt like abandoning not only my father and our family's fishing traditions, but also the larger struggle for native rights that was gaining momentum across the Pacific Northwest. The fish-ins, organized by Billy Frank Jr. and other tribal leaders, were drawing hundreds of participants and creating a powerful symbol of indigenous resistance that was inspiring Native people across the country. This isn't just about fishing anymore, explained Janet McLeod during one of our strategy meetings. This is about whether tribal sovereignty means anything, whether treaties are worth the paper they're written on, and whether Native people are going to accept second-class citizenship or fight for the rights that belong to us. The fifth arrest occurred during a major fish-in that brought together over 300 tribal members and supporters from across the region, creating a scene that attracted national media attention and political support from unlikely sources. Among the participants were actors Marlon Brando and Jane Fonda, who had come to show solidarity with our struggle and to help publicize the broader issues of Native rights and treaty obligations that our fishing rights battle represented. I'm here because the treatment of Native Americans is a national disgrace that most Americans prefer to ignore, Brando announced to the assembled media. These people aren't asking for special privileges. They're asking for the United States government to honor the promises it made in exchange for stealing their land. If we can't keep our word to Native Americans, then our word means nothing to anyone. His celebrity endorsement brought additional attention to our cause, but it also attracted criticism from people who viewed outside support as evidence that our movement was somehow artificial or manipulated. The arrest process had become almost routine by the sixth time, but the emotional impact was cumulative and increasingly difficult to bear. Watching my father worry about my safety and my family's financial security, while state officials continued to deny our most basic treaty rights, created a constant stress that affected every aspect of my life. Sweetheart, I'm proud of what you're doing, but I'm also scared that this fight is consuming you, my father told me after the sixth arrest. Your mother would be proud of your courage, but she would also want you to take care of yourself and your family while you're fighting for all of us. The legal victories that began emerging in federal court provided hope that our struggle was making progress, even as state authorities continued to arrest us for exercising rights that federal judges were increasingly recognizing as valid and protected by law. The preliminary injunctions that federal Judge George Bolt issued, restricting state interference with tribal fishing, created a complex legal situation where federal and state authorities were operating under conflicting interpretations of the law. Judge Bolt is clearly sympathetic to our legal arguments, but his final decision won't come for months, and until then, we're caught between federal protection and state harassment, explained our attorney during a meeting to discuss strategy. Every arrest strengthens our case by documenting the pattern of state interference with federally protected rights, but every arrest also creates personal and financial costs that are difficult to sustain indefinitely. The 7th, 8th, and 9th arrests occurred during the summer of 1974, as I continued fishing according to traditional practices, while state wardens continued their enforcement of regulations that we believed violated our treaty rights. The repetitive nature of the arrest cycle, fishing, arrest, jail, bail, court appearance, fine, return to fishing, created a surreal routine that dominated my life and defined my identity in ways I had never anticipated. The community support that sustained me through this period came primarily from other tribal members who understood the significance of our struggle and were willing to provide practical assistance, even when they couldn't participate directly in the protests. "You're fighting for all of us, even those who can't afford to get arrested," explained Elder Mary Kalama during one of the community meetings where our strategy was discussed. "Our children and grandchildren will inherit whatever rights we manage to protect and whatever rights we allow to be taken away." The 10th arrest came during a particularly tense confrontation in late August, when state authorities arrived with additional officers and seemed determined to make an example of the persistent troublemakers who refused to accept their interpretation of fishing regulations. "Ma'am, this is your 10th arrest for the same violation," observed Warden Peterson as he approached my fishing site. "At what point are you going to accept that the law applies to everyone, including Indians?" His question reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of both the legal issues involved and the cultural significance of what we were defending. "Officer Peterson, at what point is the state going to accept that treaties are the supreme law of the land and that your regulations can't override federal promises made to my people?" I replied as I gathered my fishing equipment. "I'll stop getting arrested when you stop violating my constitutional and treaty rights." The exchange had become almost scripted, but the underlying tension was real and growing more serious with each confrontation. The 11th arrest occurred in September, just weeks before Judge Bolt was expected to issue his final ruling on the complex legal questions surrounding tribal fishing rights in Washington state. By this point, my case had become a symbol of the broader struggle for Native rights, and each arrest was generating significant media coverage and political pressure on state officials to find a resolution to the ongoing conflict. The 12th and final arrest of 1974 came in November, just days before Judge George Bolt issued his landmark ruling that would forever change the relationship between tribal nations and state governments in the Pacific Northwest. This arrest was different from the previous 11, because I knew it would likely be my last confrontation with state game wardens who had spent the year trying to force me to abandon my treaty rights through repeated prosecution and harassment. "Rebecca Riversong, you're under arrest for violation of state fishing regulations," announced Warden Peterson for the 12th time, but his voice lacked the confidence and authority it had carried during our earlier encounters. The legal landscape was shifting beneath everyone's feet, and even state officials understood that their enforcement efforts might soon be declared unconstitutional by federal courts that were taking tribal treaty rights more seriously than anyone had expected. The night I spent in jail after my 12th arrest was peaceful and reflective, as I realized that regardless of Judge Bolt's final ruling, I had already achieved something important through my year of resistance. I had reconnected with my cultural heritage in ways that went far beyond simply fishing. I had contributed to a movement that was inspiring Native people across the country, and I had refused to accept second-class citizenship even when the personal costs were high. Judge Bolt's decision, when it came on February 12, 1975, exceeded our most optimistic expectations and vindicated every arrest, every night in jail, every legal fee, and every moment of uncertainty we had endured. The Bolt decision, as it came to be known, ruled that Washington state tribes were entitled to 50% of the harvestable salmon in traditional fishing areas, that state regulations could not supersede federal treaty rights, and that tribal fishing practices were protected by the Constitution's Supremacy Clause. Today's ruling recognizes what we have always known, that treaties between the United States and Indian tribes are not just historical documents, but living agreements that continue to define the relationship between tribal nations and other governments, I told the crowd of tribal members and supporters who gathered to celebrate the decision. Every arrest, every night in jail, every moment of harassment was worth it to achieve this recognition of our inherent rights. Lund. The implementation of the Bolt decision was not immediate or easy, as state officials and non-Indian fishing interests mounted legal challenges and political campaigns to overturn or limit the ruling's impact. Violence against tribal fishermen actually increased in the months following the decision, as some white fishermen and their supporters refused to accept that Indians had treaty rights that limited their own access to salmon runs. The court victory is just the beginning of our struggle, warned Billy Frank Jr. during one of the community meetings held to discuss how to protect our newly recognized rights. Winning in court doesn't automatically change people's attitudes or stop harassment from those who don't want to accept that treaties mean something. We're going to have to continue fighting, but now we're fighting from a position of legal strength rather than as criminals challenging unjust laws. The personal transformation I experienced through my year of arrests and legal battles was as significant as the political and legal victories we achieved. The comfortable middle-class life I had built in Seattle seemed shallow and disconnected compared to the deep sense of purpose and cultural connection I had discovered through fighting for my treaty rights. Becca, you're not the same person who moved back to the reservation 2 years ago, my father observed with obvious pride. You've become a warrior for our people, someone who understands that our traditions are worth fighting for even when the costs are high. The decision to remain on the reservation and continue working with tribal fishing programs represented a permanent commitment to the community and the cause that had transformed my understanding of my identity and responsibilities. The teaching position I accepted at the tribal school allowed me to share both my educational background and my experience as a fishing rights activist with young people who would inherit the rights we had fought to protect. Your generation will grow up with treaty rights that are recognized and protected by federal law, I would tell my students during lessons about tribal history and sovereignty. But rights that aren't exercised tend to disappear, and each generation has to decide whether they're going to use the opportunities their ancestors fought to preserve. The fish are still running in the Nisqually River, and the treaty promises are still valid, but it's up to you to decide whether those things will continue to matter 50 years from now. The marriage ceremony that Robert and I held according to traditional Nisqually customs in 1976 represented both our personal commitment to each other and our shared dedication to preserving cultural practices that connected us to our ancestors and our land. The ceremony was conducted beside the Nisqually River, on the same waters where I had been arrested 12 times for exercising rights that were now recognized as fundamental to tribal sovereignty. Today we celebrate not just the union of Rebecca and Robert, but the continuation of our people's connection to this river and these salmon runs, said tribal elder William Medicine Creek, who conducted the ceremony. The struggles of the past few years have reminded us that our cultural survival depends on our willingness to fight for what belongs to us, and to pass on to our children both the rights and the responsibilities that make us who we are. The children we raised, 2 daughters who learned to fish traditional methods and to understand both their cultural heritage and their legal rights as tribal members, grew up in a world where native treaty rights were constitutionally protected rather than criminally prosecuted. But they also learned that rights without vigilance tend to disappear, and that each generation must decide whether they're willing to defend what previous generations fought to preserve. Mom, why did you get arrested so many times when you could have just bought a fishing license? My younger daughter asked during one of our fishing trips when she was 12 years old. Her question reflected how much the world had changed since 1974, but it also reminded me that the significance of our struggle might not be obvious to people who grew up with rights that others had died to secure. Sweetheart, buying a license would have meant accepting that our treaty rights didn't matter. that promises made to our people could be ignored whenever they became inconvenient, I explained, as we prepared our nets in the early morning light. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is refuse to accept injustice, even when everyone tells you that resistance is pointless. The salmon still run in this river because people before us refused to let them be destroyed. Our treaty rights are still valid because people like your grandfather refused to let them be ignored. The legacy of the fishing rights struggle continues to influence tribal-state relations throughout the Pacific Northwest, as the precedents established by the Bolt decision have been applied to hunting rights, water rights, and environmental protection issues that affect Native communities across the region. The year I spent getting arrested for fishing became part of a larger movement that reshaped American law and demonstrated that organized resistance could overcome seemingly impossible odds. The annual salmon ceremony that our tribe continues to hold each spring includes recognition of the fishing rights warriors who fought to preserve our access to traditional foods and cultural practices. The salmon return to our river each year because our ancestors knew that some things are too important to lose, I said during the 2010 ceremony, marking the 35th anniversary of the Bolt decision. They returned because people were willing to go to jail, to sacrifice their comfort, to risk their safety to protect the connection between our people and these waters. Looking back on those 12 arrests in 1974, I understand that each one was both a personal choice and a historical necessity, part of a larger struggle for justice that required individual courage, but achieved collective victories. The handcuffs and jail cells were the price I paid for refusing to accept second-class citizenship, but they were also investments in a future where my children could exercise their treaty rights without fear of prosecution or harassment. The Nisqually River still flows past the house where I was born, and salmon still return each year to spawn in the waters where my ancestors sustained themselves for countless generations. The treaty rights that seemed so fragile in 1974 are now firmly established in federal law, protecting not just fishing practices, but a whole range of cultural and economic activities that are essential to tribal sovereignty and survival. The woman who was arrested 12 times for fishing has become an elder who teaches young people about the importance of standing up for their rights and their heritage, even when the costs seem too high to bear. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to disappear when the world wants you to vanish. And sometimes the most effective resistance is just continuing to exist and to practice the traditions that connect you to your ancestors and your land.